So firstly, thanks very much for joining the session. Um, Before going directly into the session on Romanticism, I would just like to sketch a little bit about the background or context in which this series emerges and also the previous series. So both sets of sessions are part of a book that will appear later this year called Philosophical Reflections and Insights for Psychotherapists and Psychologists. And the kind of main idea behind the book is to look at a range of philosophers from a therapeutic rather than, let's say, an epistemological or analytical or even critical perspective. What do we get when we, for example, look at Socrates therapeutically rather than, as when I studied him, it was studied in an analytic philosophy department. What do we get when we look at Plato or Aristotle, Descartes, and so on down the line? I think they're all in all about 12 or 13 philosophers that will form part of the book. And again, just to repeat it, in each of them, we'll be looking at the philosopher from a therapeutic angle. And in order to do this, my work is underpinned by a particular kind of reading of Heidegger's philosophy, not only but primarily in Being and Time. And so my belief is that on the basis of Heidegger, I've brought out a Heideggerian framework of therapy. What I'm not claiming to do is apply Heidegger to therapy. The claim that I'm making is that there's a therapy implicit in Heidegger's work. He never spoke or wrote about therapy as such. He wrote about thoughtfulness. He wrote about meditating or meditative kind of thinking. He wrote of phenomenology and hermeneutics and so on. But at no place does he kind of do any phenomenological analysis of the notion of therapy. I'm definitely not a scholar in the Heideggerian sense who can do a philological analysis of the word therapy from a therapeutic, from a Heideggerian perspective. I never had those skills. I don't have those skills. I wish I did have those skills to do that, but I don't. So my claim is that I try and bring out the the therapeutic frameworks in terms of which I believe to be implicit in Heidegger's work. And on that basis, I've developed two frameworks to look at kind of a broad look at the history of philosophy from a therapeutic practice, and therefore to address psychotherapy, in the context of the therapies of the philosophers, rather than, again, applying the philosophers to therapy. So just again, what would, for example, a Hegelian therapy look like? Or what would a kind of Nietzschean therapy look like based on the frameworks that I have believe are brought out from the work of Heidegger. Um, I'm not going to justify my reading of Heidegger tonight, um, um, because I think that we weren't set up to do that, and I didn't really do it last time either. But it will be something that's developed in the book on Heidegger. So um, there are two frameworks based on Heidegger that I have hopefully brought out from his work. The first one framed the last set of sections that we did, and it's also going to frame this set of this series as well. Um, and you may recall, and I'll go into it in some detail again, just to refresh our memories about it. It was called Being in Convention, Being in a Mood of Disruption, and Being in a World of Transformation, or actually it should be World Disclosure. But I haven't used the correct Heideggerian term there of world disclosure. I've used a more general term of being in transformation. Um, and the general idea behind this is that um, there's a rich pattern in the history of philosophy which can be seen as working with moods of disruption um, in the development of the philosophers. So last series, we would have looked at someone like Plato or Socrates, for example. And Socrates, the mood of disruption in Socrates are moments of perplexity or moments of aporia, which loosely translated, and again, I'm not a Greek scholar either, but which loosely translated means kind of being lost. And I do interpret that as being existentially lost, not just epistemologically lost. Again, the university that I was trained in with philosophy, we dealt with Socrates as a kind of analytic philosopher, and not as an existential kind of philosopher. So for me, on my path, I've come to see Socrates asking the kind of questions that he asks, the questions of the good life, because he was lost. And not only was he lost, but the period in which he emerged was a period in which Athens was also lost, in that Athens had believed itself to be, well, it was, I guess, a superior military power to Sparta, and it thought that it would go into Sparta and in 2 days it would conquer Sparta and take it over as a state, I suppose. But what was expected to last 2 days ended up lasting at least 4 years. And in that 4 year period, there was kind of widespread famine in Athens. Pericles, the ruler of Athens, himself died because of illnesses that were attributed to the wars. So Socrates emerged in a time when Athens was in a state of fundamental disruption. it couldn't take its old ways of doing things for granted. In other words, it couldn't take its habitual assumptions and practices, um, even military strategies. It couldn't take its traditional military strategies for granted anymore. It was being disrupted by the unexpected, by the surprise of Sparta. Um, and Socrates kind of starts to come to life in this space. Um, and he comes to life as a figure who says, I don't know what's happening here, you know. Um, and we need to begin with the I don't know what's happening. And he went and spoke to the generals and all levels of political society. And of course, they all turned him away. They didn't want to engage in that fundamental kind of questioning of their military conventions or political conventions or otherwise. Um, but I guess the point again, just for now, is that um, what this points to is philosophy, the questioning of fundamental conventions or beliefs or assumptions as occurring in moments of disruption, and particularly with to emphasize the mood of disruption. Again, it's not just a kind of cognitive disruption. It's a mood of disruption. So when Socrates was perplexed, it wasn't, in contrast to the school that I studied in, it wasn't just an epistemological or analytic kind of tool that he was playing with. He was genuinely perplexed by what it means to live the good life, you know, and to ask these fundamental questions. And I think one of the ways we see that is that he committed his life to it, you know. Um, he gave up being a stonemason and he committed his life to the kind of life of questioning. So, so what we see with Socrates there is a kind of a mood of disruption, perplexity, aporia, moods of being lost on the way, working with those moods of being lost. So in a sense, embracing his own lostness, you know, saying, well, the one thing I know is that I don't know. And that embracing his lostness allowed him to ask questions that those who refused to question their assumptions were not able to ask. So Socrates was able to see where others were not able to see because he could question those assumptions. And again, I want to stress it was in a mood of questioning. It wasn't just a kind of cognitive questioning. So I'd like to stress then on the basis of Heidegger that philosophy begins in moods of disruption. We are called into question. Our being is called into question, um, not simply because we are intellectuals asking questions, but because in many ways we ourselves are in question, and that it's in the mood of questioning that, if you like, the passion for philosophy emerges, and philosophy kind of becomes, for want of a better phrase, existentially significant. Outside of that, I think philosophy can sound like a set of abstractions that don't really have much to do with much. But it's not only Socrates. So this kind of reading I take into Plato as well. With Plato was very disenchanted. With Plato was brought up to be he was an aristocrat. Socrates was not an aristocrat. Plato was an aristocrat, and he was being groomed for a political career. Um, and when he saw the kind of corruption that was happening in Athens, the politics inside the politics, I guess we can say, um, and he saw what was done to Socrates by Athens, it disenchanted him, it disillusioned him. And this disillusionment it did turn him away from the practice of politics, but it did turn him towards reflecting on the nature of the political. And I think that books of his like The Republic and The Statesman emerge as a thinking through of what does the political actually mean? You know, I mean, the kind of thing that he would say, like both left and right are full of hubris. You know, they're both full of kind of demons, if you like. And so, you know, what is it to actually think the political again? And again, not just as an abstraction, uh, but as an existentially significant activity. Um, and then it goes on, and Aristotle is the next one, and there the mood is one of wonder. I then take a big jump and start to deal with Descartes. And Descartes is the mood of it's a mood of both doubt and anxiety. I think there's a lot of anxiety in Descartes that is actually explicitly mentioned in one or two of his philosophical texts. But it's definitely spoken about in the way he leads up to do his philosophy. So there's a lot of mood there in his philosophy. And continuing into, well, romantics, the mood plays a big part in romantic thinking. Even in Hegel, you know, the moods of alienation and estrangement play a major role in Hegel's thinking. And what's also, again, interesting to say about each of these philosophers is that the moods are also the lived experience. I mean, they were philosophizing out of lived experience rather than just in abstraction. And the kind of lived experience context of their thinking was also disruption of old conventions. If you think of Descartes for a moment, it was a move from kind of the authority of the kind of religion to the kind of wonder of science. And Descartes' thinking kind of emerged between the disruption of theology and the emergence of science. And again, this wasn't just an intellectual question. It was a real question for Descartes. The certainty that he wanted in his philosophy was not just a kind of logical certainty. It was an existential certainty as well. And the same with Hegel. Hegel was himself alienated from the society in which he grew up. He couldn't find a position at the university. There were radical political changes underway at the same time. And in a sense, he was writing on the street for much of his life, which we can also say about Karl Marx and others. And of course, then we come to the existential philosophers, and there we see in a whole range of philosophers the role that existential anxiety plays in the thinking of these philosophers. and again, anxiety as the basis of questioning. Um, to question, I think, in general, from an existential perspective, is to be in the mood of questioning. It's to be in the mood of uncertainty, and so. Um, in principle, I think we see that very clearly in Nietzsche's thinking, and I think that we see that very clearly in Kierkegaard's thinking. I think we see that less clearly in Heidegger's early thinking. I think in his later thinking, uh, we tend to see much more of a movement towards the mood of thought, and away from a kind of analytic language, which we see in Being and Time is quite an analytic language. And I've got a little story to tell around that a little bit later tonight as well. Um, so, so I guess the underlying idea here is that it's moods of disruption, in moods of disruption of taken for granted conventions that philosophers have disclosed uh, new worlds or opened new possibilities or have done transformative kinds of thinking. Each philosopher has disclosed a different way of language, a different way of using language, a different way of thinking. And so it's kind of moods of disruption, disrupt conventions that then disclose new worlds. So the question that was disclosed to Socrates was, what is the good life? The question that was disclosed to Plato was kind of, what is the ideal form of the state? Um, the question that was posed to Descartes was a kind of a form of logical certainty. And so each of the philosophers disclose a new world. Each of the philosophers disclose a different language. Um, and I think that this model, I don't like the word model, so because I don't, can I call it an attunement? A kind of this kind of attunement of convention, disruption, transformation. I think that this attunement also applies to so many psychotherapies as well. Um, I think that psychotherapy begins in moods of disruption. It's when our clients are disrupted, whether it's kind of anxiety, depression, issues of self-worth, trauma, personality, um, irrational thinking, whatever modality we may be operating in. It's like it's in moments of disruption that psychotherapy becomes a kind of lived possibility. Um, Interestingly enough, I have a good friend and he's been a good friend for years. And whenever I talk psychotherapy to him, he looks at me and he says things like, "Oh, you people, you just speak like wishy, kumbaya kind of moments, you know. There's nothing substantial to what you say." Um, and every time I've tried to demonstrate to him that, well, actually, there's a whole world out there. There's a whole set of worlds out there that you've kind of closed yourself to. Um, Interestingly, this friend of mine was recently separated from his partner about 8 months ago. And he decided that he would go into psychotherapy. Um, and his whole mood his whole language is in change at the moment, you know. so he'd always thought of himself as a critical thinker, and he is a critical thinker. But now he's kind of coming to embrace a sense of the unknown in his attunement. You know, it's not only critique anymore, it's also that like he's having himself opened up to himself in a way that's exciting him very much. Like me, he's in his mid-60s, and he's kind of got a zest for life now. That's like really coming out of his experience of being in psychotherapy. Not, of course, with me, with another therapist. And so just the exemplar here is, you know, how it's in moments of this kind of disruption that that the world of therapy has now become available to him. And not only is not only is he in therapy now twice a week, he's devouring all kinds of literature in therapy and craving it, you know. I'd like to say that a general point here that both philosophy, when read therapeutically, and psychotherapy uh, both work within disruption of conventions and open up new possibilities. So this friend of mine, his conventions about psychotherapy, let's say his prejudices against psychotherapy, were radically disrupted and in a very exciting way for him in opening these possibilities. So, so to me, what holds the work that I'm doing together, this is one framework of Heidegger's. There's another one, but I won't. Well, I'll mention one word of the other one. Um, um, what Heidegger says, excuse me, not in Being and Time, but in his book, what is called Thinking, he says that thinking, and I'm totally paraphrasing it here, thinking emerges out of an emotional withdrawal from the everyday world. Okay, thinking emerges out of withdrawing from the everyday world, emotionally withdrawing from the everyday world. So if we take things like anxiety or depression, in those kind of states, there is a sense of being kind of withdrawing from the everyday world. I think there are many, many ways in which we can speak about that. But just if we say, take a crisis of meaning, for example, someone who experiences a sense of meaninglessness may be able to continue functioning in the everyday world, but the everyday world loses all meaning for them. They feel themselves kind of at an emotional distance from the world. They're there, but they're not there in what they're doing. Their minds are kind of preoccupied. Sometimes it can be like starting with suicidal thoughts or very, very kind of dark thoughts around that. But it also opens up questions of, well, what is the meaning of existence? Because putting it in a paradox, when existence makes sense, we don't have to ask the question of what is the meaning of existence. It's only when the sense of existence is withdrawn from us that the question of meaning becomes a meaningful question. And I'll have something more to say about that later as well. Um, so what I want to say is that the second part of my Heidegger framework is working with this mood of withdrawing from the everyday world. And of course, that is paralleled in Being and Time. That in Being and Time, for the most part, we are absorbed in our everyday world, and it's in moods of anxiety or later in moods of boredom, and other kinds of moods that kind of lift us out of the everyday world, such that we can see the everyday world. So the moods of disruption are these moments of withdrawing from the everyday world. Um, and tonight we're going to look at that in terms of romanticism, romantic, the romantic turn in philosophy. Um, so what I'd like to start by doing is setting up romanticism in terms of the framework of convention, mood of disruption, transformation. And I'd like to do it non-analytically to start with. So I want to use a few exemplars of convention, mood of disruption, transformation in a romantic philosophy. And I'd like to revisit a movie, The Dead Poets Society. I'm not sure if many of you or most of you would have seen that movie. It was a 1980s movie, I think. So I'll do a little bit of description of that movie as a way of entering convention, disruption, transformation in a romantic framework. And yeah, um, yeah. I was going to say, if anyone has any questions or anything, please feel free to ask when you wish to ask. So the Dead Poets Society was set in a very traditional conservative school somewhere in the United States. I can't remember what the name of the school was, but it was a very traditional conservative school. And in the school, some of the ways in which that conservatism was exemplified was that the classrooms were arranged almost kind of well, they were arranged in rows. There were in each classroom there were kind of 3 or 4 rows of about 10 seats. Everything was teacher centered. The teacher stood at the front, much like I'm doing at the moment, standing at the front and lecturing or teaching, and there's one scene in particular that stands out from the movie. It was a trigonometry class, and then I think it was a Latin class as well. Uh, so these classrooms, everything's kind of arranged in rows, almost like a factory floor kind of thing. And the pupils are sitting at these desks, and the teacher standing in front of the class, and he's reciting Latin statements that the pupils are expected to learn off by heart. And so it's very much kind of a rote learning. It's what's sometimes called a banking system of education, in that you just deposit information into the heads of the pupils. And in the classroom, um, the camera pans around the classroom. The teacher himself is disinterested in what he's doing. The pupils are disinterested in what is going on. One's looking out the window, another's eating a sandwich, another's trying to talk to another one. Uh, but there's a total look of disengagement in the classroom. Um, and so that kind of paints the background of convention into which Robin Williams enters. And in the movie, Robin Williams is called Mr. Keating. Um, and he's come in uh, with the intention of disrupting these kind of embedded conventions of teaching and learning, um, um, because I guess he believes that not much teaching and learning actually goes on in those kinds of classrooms. Um, and so we see Robin Williams entering the classroom, um, and instead of kind of standing in front of the classroom, the class, sorry, and addressing them, he kind of whistles. Um, and as he whistles, he walks right through the class, and there's a door on the other side of the class. Um, and so he exits the door on the other side of the class. Um, and the students are caught totally by surprise by what he's doing. They're bewildered, they're perplexed. Um, they don't know what he's doing. But they are now attuned. Something has disrupted them, and they are now attuned to him. And so he pops his head into the classroom, and he says, "Come on." And he calls all the kids out into the kind of, I don't know, the entrance to the school, which has photos of all previous students there. And he gathers them around him, and then well, I guess the gist of what he does there is he confronts them with their mortality. He says, "Look at these kids. They've been to, I think it was Helton, I think it was the name of the school. They've been to Helton, 100 years ago, 50 years ago, and where are they now? Kind of pushing up daisies or daffodils, you know." So he confronts them straight away with their mortality. Um, and again, what's important here, it's not just the concept of mortality that he's confronting them with, it's the mood of mortality that he's creating the space for them to experience the mood of mortality. And so, yes, it is dramatized, but you see these pupils' eyes, well, with their pupils now wide open, fascinated, involved in the kind of dialogue between Robin Williams and the kids. And so that scene kind of ends. And then a later scene, well, let me say, let me try and start unpacking what is romantic in that. And I wonder if maybe we can, well, I'll say a few words, and then I'll ask if you kind of want to, come in at any time with it, bring up alternate angles as well. So, um, um, what we can say about the Romanticism and rationalism have a strong relationship with each other. excuse me, uh, generally speaking, whether it was in poetry, philosophy, literature, um, Romanticism and rationalism emerged in response to emerged out of the Enlightenment. Um, and the Enlightenment was a period of transformation in thinking. Um, and again, it was it was an emergence from trusting as the authority, the priest, the imam, the rabbi, or the holy speaker, uh, into the opportunity for free thinking. Um, and both rationalism and romanticism uh, privilege the notion of free thinking. Uh, Both are into thinking for yourself, rather than trusting the authority of convention. Um, so both believe in the reasoning for ourselves. Both are also a sense of excitement about what man can do for himself, that man can kind of take charge of his own destiny, that we don't need to just pray to the gods, so to speak. We can manage our own history. We can, in fact, create the grand narratives. And I think that's where you get kind of the grand narratives starting to emerge of liberalism, well, rationalism, later Marxism, capitalism, technology, all these, even what's the behaviorist's name? Skinner, he's totally engineered society, that man can take charge of his own destiny. Um, and at that point, it was very exciting to be able to think like this. Um, but a cleavage started to emerge between romanticism and rationalism in terms of what was meant by free thinking. Um, and in the rational tradition, um, uh, so just glossing over it very, very generally, um, but um, thinking came to be identified with rationality, okay? And rationality came to be identified with scientific thinking, and with kind of logical thinking. So maybe a few centuries later, you got emerging the logical positivists. So there was logical positivism and scientific thinking, um, and romanticism has nothing against either of these two, rationality or scientific thinking. What Romanticism objected to was what I guess we can call a kind of rational fundamentalism in rationality. And the rational fundamentalism in rationality was the view that only that which is capable of being verified is worth talking about. Um, Anything that is not capable of being verified uh, is not worth talking about. So Karl Popper changed that slightly later, but there's no need for us to go into that. But rationality rested on this idea that only if it could be verified by observation um, would it be counted as something worth talking about. So all kinds of things started getting ruled out there. Stories of God, for example, started getting ruled out because we can't operationalize God into something that's quantifiable, that's measurable, that's observable. Similarly, the idea of the unconsciousness is also ruled out of study, of worthy attention. And paradoxically, even the question of meaning becomes a meaningless question, because meaning is not a question that can be quantified. Uh, Meaning is felt sense. It's making sense of something. It's not anything. It's not any object in itself. And so what we begin to see emerging with rationalism, rational fundamentalism, is a kind of closing down of the world, that the world can only deal with those kinds of things that are quantifiable. And anything that is not quantifiable is dismissed as empty and meaningless. So again, the question of meaning is a meaningless question. Um, and so I guess some of the ways that we see that today, I think, are in terms of bureaucratic organizations. That in bureaucratic organizations, um, I'm not sure if you're familiar with the language hard skills and soft skills. But let's say I taught for 20 years or so in a management school, and they kept making this distinction between the hard skills and the soft skills. Um, and the hard skills were finance, uh, were economic rationality, uh, um, anything that was capable of being measured, the bottom line, so to speak. Those were the hard skills. Those were what can be rationally worked with. Anything to do with the emotions is seen as the soft skills. And I mean, I taught there for over 20 years, and managers didn't see any need for the soft skills. They didn't see any need for um, attunement or presence. If it could be measured and turned into something quantifiable, they would definitely have it as something that they would analyze. Um, and but it wasn't. And so you'll often find courses at management schools. The students gravitate more towards what they call the hard skills: accounting, finance, economics, negotiation skills, because they believe all those kinds of things can be measured. But the soft skills can't be measured, and so they're dismissed as meaningless altogether. When I taught at the management school, I tried for about 10 years to get a course on ethics going. There were never more than 6 people in a class out of about 300 in an ethics class in a management school, because I guess much of ethics is also part of a soft skill rather than a hard skill. So bureaucracies are very much like this. And when we do Hannah Arendt, which I think will be the last session of the series, we will be looking at the effects of that kind of bureaucratic thinking in terms of her notion of the banality of evil, of how this kind of concern with bottom line produces evil, a kind of evil, a banality of evil, because the people who are committing the evil are not even aware that they're committing that evil. And I don't know whether you have clients like this, but I have a number of clients who have been retrenched from their organizations, not on the quality of the service, but because they don't fit into the kind of spreadsheet of the accountants on the top floor of the organization. And these clients come in pain and hurt. And those on the top floor are drinking good wine and eating good lunch and so on. Uh, so, uh, so there's a kind of in Hannah Arendt's terms, there's a kind of toxicity going on there that needs to be brought out more. And in psychotherapy, I think that the kind of tyranny to me of evidence-based psychotherapy has also narrowed down the scope of what psychotherapists can and cannot do. So how does this relate to Robin Williams and the distinction between romanticism and rationality? So rationality becomes that process of reasoning which reduces reasoning, as I've said, to rationality. And there are at least two kinds of dimensions to rationality. There's logical rationality and there's scientific rationality. Logical rationality is that kind of rationality which can be expressed in the form of propositions or statements that can be then analyzed logically to see whether they are true or false or valid or invalid. So in other words, only that which can be expressed in the form of a proposition or in the form of a story, in the form of a statement, is meaningful from a rationalist perspective. And the Romantics were saying, no, that what happens if we reduce our lives to rationality, scientific and logical kind of rationality, if we reduce our lives to that, we actually leave out so many of the dimensions of what it means to be a human being. I recall reading a book or two by Rolla May a number of years ago. I think one was called The Cry for Myth, and the other one was called Love and Will, I think. And I think in both of those books, he spoke about what I think it was him that called it existential crises of emptiness and meaninglessness. And kind of one of the lines of argument that he took was that kind of emptiness and meaninglessness arose not just because some individuals experienced meaninglessness, but because there was a much wider kind of cultural sense of meaninglessness, and that putting it in broad terms, that actually we were living in times of meaninglessness. And that's the kind of thing that Romanticism kind of articulates as well, that the danger of scientific rationality is that it erodes storytelling as meaningful. It erodes poetry. It erodes. It erodes. It erodes the arts of meaning, um, and thereby also depriving people of a sense of meaning and purpose in their lives. Um, and for Romanticism, um, meaning and purpose was central to what it means to be a human being, to kind of aspire to meaning, to aspire to purpose. Um, and this kind of distinction between romanticism and rationality is also illustrated in another scene in the Dead Poets Society. Um, and the scene was something like this. Um, that they're sitting, um, the class is sitting in kind of rows, um, and Robin Williams is at the front of the class, um, and he's standing in front of the class, and he asks one of the pupils in the class to um, read from a book uh, called An Introduction to Poetry. And so the pupil starts reading from the book. He starts reading the introduction, and the introduction to poetry is all about how to plot uh, a graph of by which to measure good and bad poetry. So there's kind of, a vertical axis and a horizontal axis, and there are two kinds of dimensions. There are two kind of quantifiable dimensions in terms of which poetry can be read. And Robin Williams allows the student to go on, and Robin Williams starts plotting the graph on the board at the end of the chapter. So he plots the whole graph, um, and he turns round to the students, um, and he says excrement. He says bullshit. He says you can't do poetry by plotting graphs. You kill the spirit of poetry by doing it against the graph. You take the poetry out of poetry by doing it like this. Um, so again here we see a kind of the tyranny, if you like, of rationality in trying to reduce poetry to something that is measurable, and that what you're studying is the measurability of the poem rather than actually being engaged in the poem. And so Robin Williams says, bullshit. There's a lot of nonsense. And he invites the students to tear out the first page of the introduction to their book. And then he invites them to tear out the whole first chapter of the book, in which the kind of, the mathematical plot of poetry is given. And so in this way, you begin to see the students like very disrupted. And you begin to see students caught between excitement and anxiety. So, and which I call anxietement. There's kind of a lot of anxiety. There's a lot of excitement at this same time. There's a sense of bewilderment in the class. But precisely that sense of bewilderment is a mood that's happening in the class. While the class was doing Latin, or while the class was doing trigonometry, or even while the class was reading the introduction to the poetry, the class weren't there. The students weren't present in what they were doing. They were looking out the window, they were talking to each other, they were yawning, they were eating sandwiches. But at all these moments of disruption, again, earlier when Robin Williams took the kids outside, at all these moments of disruption, um, the mood of the classroom switched fundamentally, and the kids' faces became totally animated by what was going on. Yes, in a spirit of both anxiety and excitement, but they were there, they were captivated, they were involved, they were engaged, they were in a mood. And in that mood, Robin Williams drew them in together to poetry. So he actually destabilized the traditional classroom as well, and he got the class to sit in a circle, uh, and he read some poetry out to them. And I think the poem was from Walt Whitman, whose poetry I don't really know. Um, but the final line of the poem from Walt Whitman was, "What is your verse going to be? You know, what is your story going to be in life?" And these were kids that hadn't been groomed for developing their own story. These were kids who'd been kind of groomed for following a particular career path. You know, they would, I don't know, in the UK, the A levels or the O levels, I'm not sure. But anyway, the highest levels, they were being groomed for the highest levels to get the highest professions. Their career was kind of known for them in advance. All they had to do was work really hard to get there. So they developed good calculative, rational capacities of thinking. They knew how to think analytically very well. And they worked hard and they were capable of achieving. But Robin Williams was opening something else to them. He was asking them, you know, he was asking them to imagine. He was asking them to wonder. He was asking them to think. He was asking them to be curious. And they were uh, together in a mood of curiosity. And so that also takes us to another dimension of the distinction between rationality and romanticism. Romanticism is very much about engagement, about being engaged um, with each other, with oneself, with the world in which one lives. Rationality, on the other hand, is very much a disengaged kind of process. In rationality, we're taught to be scientific observers of the world. We stand back at a distance and become neutral observers of what's going on, rather than involved participants in the world. Um, and I think we see that in early psychology as well. I mean, I think Freud and early psychoanalysis was also very much kind of, I mean, Freud wanted to be a scientist above all early on, and you know, his idea of the psychoanalyst was someone who was quite detached and uninvolved in the client. Um, and, you know, again, we also see that we also see that in terms of organizations, in terms of management. Um, the dominant ideology in management and it still is the dominant ideology, no matter how much it's watered down in different ways, but was that a leader does the thinking and a worker does, well, the working. The workers don't think. The leaders do the observing of the workers. They plot out the best work practices. They then implement the best practices through the non-thinking worker, who's just a behavior machine. Um, and I guess so it goes in scientific management, you know. The worker, the manager is a scientist who observes. The worker is someone who's who who's got the local knowledge of an of a worker is totally disregarded. And I don't know about you, but my experience of being in my university, uh, I haven't been at a university since the 2020. But before that, it was becoming quite radical at the university that our courses were being plotted on higher levels than the teachers. We were expected to teach the same way as each class was expected to have the same kind of format. So if I was teaching psychology, the next psychology class was expected to have the same format, and it was designed from above, rather than allowing the local knowledge of the teacher to play a kind of big part in designing and creating courses. And so, from a romantic perspective, I mean, that produces a sense of estrangement and a sense of alienation, and a sense of unhappiness, you know. Um, and I think perhaps it's just worth mentioning again that Romanticism is saying that this is not so much about the individual. This is much more about the kind of cultural conventions for thinking that go on in a society, you know. So in our society, the dominant and the still dominant cultural convention is rationality, you know, and it is a convention. Um, and the alienation that many of us feel um, is a kind of romantic alienation, of being estranged from our stories, um, and um, um, and having no stories, um, you know, and kind of clients coming in with a sense of emptiness and you know, kind of nothing that they really believe in. Anything anymore. Nothing which kind of takes their passion. And I also remember this coming up in Rollo May's work as well, the kind of numbness that's kind of often found in many clients, that they just don't feel anything anymore. They don't have a felt sense of anything. Um, and in a sense, I guess, well, maybe I'm arguing this more than anyone else, but um, that rationalism has created the situation in which that numbness is kind of seen as a kind of virtue almost, you know, because many of these people who come in numb can actually function efficiently, very well in a context, but they have no meaning or very little meaning in what they are doing. So on the one side is Romanticism, um, which stresses kind of the re-enchantment of the world, you know. The idea behind the re-enchantment of the world is that rationality has disenchanted the world. Um, I don't know if any of you may be familiar with the sociologist Max Weber's work. Max Weber coined the term for organizational hierarchies. Excuse me. He called them iron cages. Hierarchies are iron cages because they take the humanness out of the organization, and they're held together only by a rigid set of kind of rules and laws that have what he believed to be legal, rational authority. Uh, and he said that these are the only ways in which organizations can function. But the consequence of organizations functioning like this is they deprive meaning for people in the organizations. Um, and so Romanticism is a response to the kind of this, to re-enchant the world in which we kind of live, um, and to re-enchant it by creating the space for storytelling, and not only storytelling, but seeing ourselves um, as stories. We are stories to unfold. That's, I think, what Robin Williams was doing with the kids in his poetry class, was telling them that they are stories to be told. Their life is a story. They're not just functions to fit in to a system. They're also stories to grow and develop. And he never denied, and Romanticism never denies the value of rationality. What it objects to is the fundamentalism or the reduction of reality to rationality. Rather than seeing, what romantics would see, rationality, calculative rationality is a means to ends, but it's not an end in itself. And it kind of does away with the thinking of ends, the purpose, what is the purpose behind which we do? Who are we as purposes? So there's almost this kind of polarity then between romanticism and rationalism. Rationalism is disengaged. Romanticism is engaged. Romanticism is full of mood. Mood and thinking are not simply separated from each other, whereas in rationality, the worst thing you can do is be in a mood when you're thinking. You've got to be detached and disengaged and objective and uninvolved. In romanticism is all about building relationships between yourself, other people, the world in which we live. In rationality, the world is reduced to material resources to be manipulated and worked on. It's kind of not seen as a home in which we live. It's seen there as just material for us to work on. So from the romantic perspective, we lose the sense of connectivity to our world, to each other and those around us. And again, that's not only because of our individual psyches, it's because of this kind of cultural context of rationality. So there's a number of dimensions then on which romanticism and rationality both emerge out of the Enlightenment. Both are excited by the kind of, what the human being can do, but in rationality, it's kind of the human being is the head. It's the Cartesian kind of head that's detached from the body. It's not about actualizing the self. of the person. It's only about the head. Whereas in Romanticism, it's not only about self-actualization, it's also about becoming in the context of the world in which we live. We're always in relationship to the world in which we live. Um, and Romanticism sees its challenge as re-enchanting the world.